Welcome to the latest edition of the Mind-Gut Conversation, the interview series about topics related to health of the gut, the brain, and the environment. Today, I have the pleasure to talk to Dr. Joan Ifland, founder and chair of Refined Food Addiction Research Foundation. Dr. Ifland is also the author of several authoritative books on the topic of food addiction, including Sugars and Flours, How They Make Us Crazy, Sick, and Fat. And she'll probably tell us more about some of the other, including the textbook that she has published. She has been teaching professional and lay audiences about food addiction since 1996. Welcome to the show, Dr. Ifland.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So let me start out with a very simple question about your main area of interest. How do you define food addiction, and can food addiction be compared to other forms of substance abuse and addiction?
Yes, that's a great question. There are two main bodies of evidence for food addiction that really define the disease. The first one is the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders. There are 11 behaviors that, say, a drug counselor would use to diagnose drug addiction or alcoholism in a patient. And those criteria are valid when applied to eating, particularly eating processed foods. And I'll just run through them real quick. Well, the first one is unintended use, where you think you're going to just have one bite, but you eat the whole box. Or you say, I'm going to, follow my diet this morning, and then by 10 o'clock you've fallen off. The next one is failure to cut back. And we know that that's an epidemic level. People cannot take off weight and keep it off. Number 3 is time spent, where you're getting and eating and then sleeping off processed foods. 4 is cravings. And then there are 3 kind of more outward criteria. It's problems in relationships. You have slacked off going to activities, and you're not able to fulfill roles. And then there's one called hazardous use, where you're driving out of the fast food place and driving with your elbow and pushing in the French fries and drink. And then there are the 3 that really show the progression of it, which is continuing to eat in spite of consequences. Withdrawal, where you're eating not because you're hungry, but because you're angry or you have a headache or you're tired. And then tolerance, where you used to get 1 carton of ice cream a couple of times a week, and gradually that's built up to a couple a night. So that's a really powerful way to define food addiction. And then you can define it neurologically, where you see in the brain of a chronic user of processed foods, an overeater, that you see the same dysfunction. You see very hyperactive craving activity in the limbic system. There is a hyperactive stress reaction in the corticotropin releasing factor pathway, CRF pathway. And then you see hypoactivity. There's not enough activity in the frontal lobe, which is crucial because this is where the braking system is, and it's crashed. So the parallels are very strong. Yeah.
Yeah, listening to you, this sounds very convincing. From our personal experience with grant submissions and manuscript submissions, we have often run into opposition to use that term food addiction, and people have kind of push towards predominant hedonic eating or exclusive hedonic eating. Why do you think that term is not, given the similarities, is not universally accepted?
So I have to share that my undergraduate degree from Oberlin College is in political science and economics. And I worked for the Wisconsin State Legislature for 2 years, and then went to business school. I took my MBA from Stanford in 1978. And for a lot of years, I thought that wasn't applicable, but it turns out it's right at the center of this phenomenon, because what you look back to is tobacco coming into processed foods in the 1980s. And they have a business model. It's the addiction business model involving a lot of advertising, availability, affordability, aimed at young ages, and then really hyped up addictive properties in the product. So the processed food industry now, the food industry, is 13 times bigger than tobacco. So what does that mean? That means that the processed food industry has also moved into Washington. And we see this terrible effect. For example, Senator Flake at one time published a waste book. So these were like the worst, most offensive examples of government waste. And on that list was research into food addiction. So the processed food industry, the sugar industry especially, they're very, very effective at getting their lobbyists in front of the congressional legislators. Yeah. So so then the Congress pushes out that that attitude into the granting organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. So talking about the prevalence of this problem. So based on questionnaire studies using the Yale Food Addiction Questionnaire, it's been estimated about 20% of obese individuals meet the criteria of food addiction based on the measures. And then with higher prevalences with increasing BMI, and probably the highest ones in individuals that go for bariatric surgery. Are these numbers pretty much what you would agree with?
No, and so let's just go back to the criteria, the DSM-5 substance use disorder criteria. I think the Yale Food Addiction Scale vastly underestimates prevalence. It's made a classic error that everybody makes. It has mixed up this concept of eating disorder with processed food addiction. And once you do that, it just dilutes the measure of the addiction. Because it would be like saying, okay, so here I have a cocaine abuser, but I'm not calling them a cocaine abuser. I'm calling them, they have a snorting disorder. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or, and for the heroin addict, oh, they have a shooting up disorder. Mm-hmm. Or the smoker has a breathing disorder, because they've gotten fixated on the method of entry into the body, and they have missed this is a pure substance use disorder, but it's very easily confused because there's so many different substances, they're mixed in with our food, and it's very blurry, but it's a substance use disorder. Mm-hmm. So when you start to put in like, oh, does the snorter do this, or do they do that? And then you only get cocaine addiction if you have this particular snorting activity. No. Mm-hmm. It's cocaine abuse, and they're doing things with cocaine, and you're focused on the cocaine and how do they use the cocaine and how often do they use it and those kinds of issues. So once you get just purely behavioral issues mixed in with the substance use, that really doesn't have anything to do with how the substance is being abused, then you get dilution. And so when you look at the research, you see, for example, really high prevalence rates. The percentage of people who are dieting at any time, it's very high in this country. in the US. And all those people are meeting criteria number 2, failure to cut back. And then you have unintended use. So there's a study that was actually done by one of the soda companies. It's reported on in Michael Moss's Sugar, Fat, Salt book. Unintended use. 60% of grocery store purchases, decisions, are made after the person enters the store. So 60% of all purchases are unintended use. They're in response to bombardment of queuing inside the grocery store. And then you look at things like the compliance numbers. A doctor gives out advice to a diabetic patient or a high blood pressure patient, diet advice, and the person doesn't follow it. I mean, those rates are very, very high. That is used in spite of knowledge of consequences. So there are 3 criteria that you do have very good evidence. There's one more, which is tolerance. And what you do see is in the years when the tobacco industry is coming into processed foods, you see the use of addictive foods just skyrocket by 30% between 1970 and 1997. And these are wheat containing gluten, corn flour, high-fat dairy, and French fries, potatoes for French fries. So that's a national basis. Now, at this point, 1997, we have statistics showing that people are eating a pound per person per day. A pound per person per day of sugars, flours, high-fat dairy, and French fries. So when you have that level of consumption, no, this is not at the 20% level. This is much more at the, I'll give you one little story, a quick little story. At one point, I've tried a lot of different things over the years, 23 years I've been doing this, to help people get off of processed foods, because it's a very difficult thing to do. And at one point I had a prepared meal company, and we were serving a very, very prestigious law firm. So I would put these high-end lawyers, these are the highest functioning people on the planet, close. And I would talk to them at the end of the week, and this is what they would say. Joan, I'm so surprised my cravings seem to be gone. And I'm thinking more clearly. And I'm not having that mid-morning, mid-afternoon, early evening slump. So do you think that's related to the food? And I was shocked. But those are all symptoms of those are all reactions to processed foods. So they're at that very high level of functioning. The processed foods were taking a toll. They were having an impact. So when you look at the vast quantity and you look at where it's appearing, unless somebody has already very conscientiously eliminated those foods, I've never met anybody who doesn't have some symptoms of processed food addiction.
Interesting. So one thing that, so in our research, we have not typically used the qualification processed food addiction, but it seems to be a very important part in this concept. So yeah. I just tell you like a personal story. I just got back from an event in Italy. A friend of mine opened this olive oil and wine store in a place called Fermo. And so there were celebrations around this with all the locals in this relatively small town, and we had celebrations with the workers, with the farmers. It was a quite an interesting experience. And I have to say, during those 3 days I was there, there was a lot of consumption of carbs, pasta as the appetizer, not as the main dish. Potatoes made in the oven, baked in the oven.
Yeah.
But you looked at the people, and they're not obese, and I don't think anybody that I encountered there was that I would call food addicted.
Right.
So there's something, it's not necessarily just the quantity of these ingredients, it's the quality.
Well, it's the whole business model. So when you look at the business model, I call it the 5 A's of an addiction epidemic. They all have to be present. And when you, the one that the tobacco industry was really good at is advertising to small children. So remember, advertising is one of the A's, and age of onset is the other one. So you want to try to hyperactivate those craving neurons, dopamine, serotonin, opiate, endocannabinoid. Those, you want to try to activate and train, Pavlovian conditioning, train those neurons to hyper respond to cues for the addictive substance. So that's why tobacco really, they developed the Joe Cool cartoon. Joe Cool was a camel character who was very sexy and very macho and smoked camels. So that was aimed at 10-year-old boys. And Congress did stop that campaign. These are tragically effective. So you have just you see in the years after tobacco comes into the processed food industry, you see this incredible increase in the number of Saturday morning commercials on cartoon programs, from about 160 commercials in 1988 to by early 1990s, 7 years later, it's 560 commercials for sugary, fatty, salty foods in one Saturday morning. And then you look at Nickelodeon carried those commercials to 65 million households. That is not going on in Italy. Other thing that happened, so those are 2 of the A's. The third thing that happened is that the tobacco companies ramped up the addictive properties of processed foods. So they hired consultants to maximize the amount of sugar in products, right to where the customer would start to say, no, that's too sweet. Right to that point, they ramped up the amount of salt, particularly in children's foods, like the Lunchables, and then they ramped up the fat content. That is not happening in Italian pasta. And the other thing is that American wheat, due to a hybridization program in the 1940s, the gluten content in American wheat is about twice what it is in Italian wheat, and gluten contains a natural morphine. So when you take out the fiber and you concentrate it into flour, you create an addictive response. It does not exist in Italy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've seen this with patients who have gone to Italy for a year of college. And when they went over there, you know, they lost weight and had none of these symptoms. And the minute they came back, their original weight returned and their cravings returned.
Yeah.
And I personally have experienced that as well. I mean, like during that visit in Italy, I probably might have eaten twice as much as I eat at home of carbs. And if anything, you know, I've lost a couple of pounds during that time.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very effective model. You know, the other piece is availability. And you see, for example, when I started out into the corporate world, I graduated from business school in 1978, and I worked for a Fortune 200 corporation in their corporate offices. And no one would ever eat in a meeting. No, you would never carry food into a meeting. You wouldn't even carry water or tea. It was coffee. And that was all anybody drank in a meeting. And today, you can't, I understand that if you want to have a meeting, you've got to get the cookies in, you've got to get the breakfast rolls in, you've got to get all these fancy coffees in. And now the break rooms are full. Like our break rooms didn't have any food in it. They just had coffee in them. Mm-hmm. And now the break rooms are full of processed foods. The availability in vending machines of sodas. You know, there's a vending machine. They tried to get vending machines into elementary schools, and they succeeded. And then there was a big fight to get them back out again. So the availability, the advertising, the constant bombardment of cueing, triggering, reminding, food stimulation. Oh gosh, you know, that doesn't exist in rural Italy.
Yeah.
Goodness.
and the interesting thing is, you know, you were mentioning the Sunday morning commercials targeted as kids. If you look at the commercials in the evening, it's all about chronic illness, you know, medications for chronic illness, part of which are really a consequence of these altered eating habits and type 2 diabetes and it's pretty amazing. I mean, this is a huge business, obviously, and at different levels, not just food industry, but also the pharmaceutical. I mean,
pharmaceutical, surgery, healthcare, diet industry, glamour industry. It is pervasive. It is pervasive. Yeah.
So let me ask you another question. In other types of addiction, there's always the combination of genetic vulnerability and exposure to the addictive substance.
Yeah.
And in today's society, cheap, high-caloric food, as we talked about, is abundant and easily accessible. What role do our genes play in this? And are there some people more vulnerable to this toxic environment than others?
Yes, we do have evidence for a role for genetics, two different possibilities. One is a genetic propensity to overproduce dopamine, in which case you pursue it because it's so rewarding. And then the other one is underproduction of dopamine. And then you're pursuing it because it's the only thing that makes you feel okay. So there are two there, but there are a couple of pieces of evidence that that's not what's driving the obesity epidemic. One is that the obesity epidemic took off really fast. So once those Saturday morning cartoons hit the air, the rate of obesity in the 2 to 19-year-old range went from 10% to 15% in about 10 years. Mm. That's not long enough to change the gene pool. Mm-hmm. That's a 50% increase in obesity rates in children age 2 to 19. In 10 years, that's not a genetic issue. That's an environmental issue. And then the other thing we know with really good evidence is that you might be born with a set of genes and they're replicating in a certain way, but it takes in the environment influences whether a gene is going to be turned on or off. Now, I'll give you an example. This is incredible research from out of Germany. Bodo Melnick did this research. And what he was able to show is that dairy turns on an acne gene and a prostate cancer gene. It turns them on, and it turns on a weight gain gene. So we know dairy is designed to put 500 pounds onto a 100-pound calf in a year. So it's not surprising that you would see that dairy would turn on a weight gain gene. You've got it. So the saying I really like is the gene is the trigger, but environment pulls the trigger. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So going from the genes to another factor that often is implicated in food addiction, what role does, in your opinion, play the mind? So is there a relationship between stress, depression, anxiety, social isolation and the likelihood to become addicted to food.
Yes, yes. So this is also a source of grave confusion. Like you will hear people say, oh, you're not going to stop your overeating until you resolve your childhood issues. And why do they say this? Because there's a really high correlation between childhood trauma and overeating. So childhood trauma is, and the research on this is really strong. It's an adverse childhood experience. It's called an ACE, ACE, and there are 9 kinds of them. And the more different kinds of childhood trauma, these adverse experiences, a person has received, the more likely they are to have a whole range of medical problems through their whole lives. It seems like maybe they just don't get enough self-esteem to take care of themselves. Or it could be the stress factor that you mentioned. So we do know, this is great research out of Boston, that as this craving pathway becomes more and more reactive and more producing more and more dopamine, there is a reaction in that CRF pathway, corticotropin releasing factor. So the brain releases that factor, it travels to the adrenal glands and releases corticosterol, cortisol, what we call adrenaline. And so this is a chemically induced stress. It's not related to outside life. It's an abnormal chemical reaction inside the person. So how do I know this? How do I experience? So when people come off of processed foods, they really have, they markedly notice a decrease in stress. Gosh, I just feel less anxious. I seem to know what to do. And I just feel less stressed out. You know, is that because of the food? Yeah, it is because of the food. It's like you're taking a stress pill. Okay, now I feel stressed. Now I don't. It's a chemical reaction. Nonetheless, that chemical reaction, the sad thing about it is that it stimulates cravings. So now you're in this stress craving loop. These are 2 brain pathways that are stimulating each other in a tight loop. And this can progress. It can get worse and worse until one researcher identified a phenomenon called thought fusion. And that's where the thought of food and a stressful thought co-occur. You don't have one without the other. And this is what it sounds like inside the head of a food addict. It sounds like, oh, I'm hungry, I gotta eat. I don't wanna eat, I just don't wanna get fat. All right, I'll just have one. Oh my God, I ate the whole thing. Oh, I hate myself. Now I'm gonna have to go get 2. No, I'll get 3 and I'll hide one in the laundry room and I'll eat it later. And oh gosh, I hope nobody sees me. All day long. Yeah. All day long. And this has had a huge impact on my approach to how to help people, because once you know that's what's going on in their head, you know that teaching them is not going to help them. So the other piece of this is that as this obsession progresses, they don't want to be around people. First of all, they're having a hard time paying attention to them because that's a cognitive function which is impaired. And secondly, they might feel that their body is unacceptable. They don't want people to see them. And third of all, they don't want to get that far away from their processed food stash. And unlike drinking that might take place in a bar or at social events, but out of the house, binging and food addiction takes place inside the house. And people do hide and they're ashamed. So isolation follows right into this. And it's another barrier to getting help to them. Yeah.
So with all these complicating factors, I mean, you have established a successful program to help people.
Yes.
How would you, in brief, I mean, I'm sure it's a complex undertaking, but in brief, what are the key elements that play a role in the success of your program?
So once you know that the frontal lobe is not working, and that's where learning takes place, decision making, restraint, memory, satiation, emotional processing, and attention. Once you know you don't have that to work with, you've got to go somewhere else in the brain, and where you go is to the mirror neurons. So mirror neurons do one thing: they copy other people's behavior. And I think, I don't have the evidence on this, but this is my personal opinion. No, not entirely personal. I do have some research to back this up. This is the most powerful pathway in the brain. So in primitive times, if you're in a tribe and your tribe suddenly starts running, you run. And you can see the pathway for that. The mirror neurons they have a pathway directly to locomotion. So you ran. Your mirror neurons got you to run. And anybody who stopped to wonder what was going on, they got eaten by the predator. They didn't survive to pass on their genes. So we still have a very powerful, perhaps the most powerful mirror neuron system. It is able to override cravings. It's able to override the stress pathway. It's able to override the frontal lobe. So I saw this. I hadn't studied mirror neurons, but we've been doing supportive things out in Facebook, online, because these people are in their homes, they're hiding in their homes. So we needed to reach them where they are. So we've been doing like phone calls and Facebook groups, not very successfully. And then we got introduced to Zoom, which you and I are on right now. And as soon as I started using Zoom, that day, people who had not been able to make a clean meal, an abstinent meal we call them, they made a clean meal. Like they started the day, Joan, I'm terrified. I don't want to give up the processed foods. It's the only friend I have. And then when we did our check-in at the end of the day, having been visiting with them all day long, they're like, well, I ate clean today. I'm like, you did what? And that opened the door. That got me to see something else entirely different is going on. So we do, I'll give you an example of a great study. These are researchers, actually the nest of researchers who found this are Italian. They're in Parma. Anyway, they were doing monkey research. This was research in humans. So one researcher lies down on the ground and fakes a medical emergency. Dire, screaming, help, help, help me. If there's one person in the vicinity, that person will run right over 90 to 100% of the time. So, but if you put two researchers in a group of 5 people, so you have 2 researchers, 3 bystanders, and this researcher over here starts to create the medical emergency. These 2 researchers standing here are ignoring it. They're looking away. The percentage of people who will break away from that group of 5 people and go help drops to 40%. Yeah. So what's going on there? The mirror neurons of those 3 people are like, okay, nobody else is going. They must know something I don't know. I'm not going. That's mirror neurons. And it seems to be a group of 5. There's another really good study. The psychology professor takes 20 kids to New York City, puts them on one side of the street, sends one kid over to the other side of the street to look up at a window. and they count how many people passing by look up at the window. You know, maybe it's 40%. So they send one more kid over. 2 kids are looking up at the window. The percentage increases until they've got 5 kids over there. About 80% of people are now looking up at the window. And if you add the 6th person, it doesn't matter. You still have 80% of people looking up at the window. That's great research showing that the crucial number is 5. So when we get 5 people onto a Zoom screen, all their mirror neurons are like, oh, what are they doing? We're going to copy that.
Very interesting.
Unbelievable success. Yeah.
If somebody wants to join this program, how can they get in touch with you?
They should go to foodaddictionreset.com, and there they can sign up there. And we made it very inexpensive. It's $12 a week, which is this affects people's finances like any addiction does. So we can put about 125 people into one, we call them ARCs, Addiction Reset Communities. And then the business model works. This is something that we want to replicate and put into practitioners' offices so that every doctor, every coach, lifestyle coach, every nutritionist, dietitian, every dentist, every doctor of osteopathy, that they would have a video chat function in their practice. I met a doctor, I was just at a conference over the weekend. I met a doctor who said, it's a membership practice. He has 558 patients. He said 60% of them would benefit tremendously from a diet change, and they can't make it.
Amazing.
So he's going to send me some patients to trial with, and then gradually, it's something that, like maybe we offer 5 hours a day of live interaction. I have a person in the UK who opens the Zoom screen at 8 o'clock for an hour. I come on for 2 hours of video chat, and we have a social hour, just reinforcing those mirror neurons, and then a conference call at the end of the day. And that's not enough. So if somebody had this degree, this severity of addiction, they'd be going for residential treatment. Residential treatment for food addiction doesn't work because the prime trigger for this population is their home. So they come home from residential treatment, the mirror neurons say, oh yeah, I know this place. This is where we binge. Let's binge. It's like, so all the residential cueing is attached to that place. And place cues have been shown to be very powerful. The place cues if you cue that craving pathway enough, it can override the mirror neurons. So it's a race to program the mirror neurons to identify, oh, this is my tribe. I eat the way this tribe. So that if they get some stimulation, instead of saying, oh, that looks great, I'm going to eat that, they get and the braking system's not working, right? So they never get the message, oh, my doctor said not to eat that. No, that message never gets through the chatter. But what you race to do is program the mirror neurons to the point where you see these highly addictive substances and mirror neurons say, oh, my tribe doesn't eat that. That's what you're going for. And it's so exciting to see that happen. Yeah.
Well, we could still talk for quite some time. Fascinating conversation, really. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time, and hopefully our paths will cross again in the future.
I would like to return the invitation, and I would like to set up a time when I could interview you about that gut-brain connection. It's an area of research that I did not get into, so I have a lot to learn there, and my population is fascinated with that topic. So yes, I hope we do get to visit.
I'd be delighted to do it. So, please get in touch with me.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ifland, for this fascinating.
Thanks for inviting me.